So our family moved here, and I was 4 years old, and my parents, when we were younger, we never really knew their story. And so we really didn't understand anything at all. And here they're taken, I think they're in their early 80s, because now they're 95. It was my mother's, just her birthday this week. And this is their wedding photo that was taken after the war. And they were in a displaced persons camp for, I think, about 3 years, from 1945 to 1948, because those that survived the Holocaust, like other refugees, they had no place to go. People couldn't come to the United States unless they had a sponsor. Someone had to sponsor them so that they wouldn't go on government relief, and there was a quota of immigration then, but my mother was fortunate. She had a cousin who had emigrated to America, and she was able to find him, and he sponsored them to come in 1948. So that's how they came here to California. Both my parents were from this small town in Poland that is in this writing here called Izbica Kowalska. And I've never been there. My father said that he would take us many times, but he never got around to it. He always was very busy with his business. And we attributed his busyness later, and we equated it to his survival from Auschwitz, because he's just running on sheer brain power. I don't know, he still does it, running on sheer brain power. And he was in Norco yesterday. He still comes to his office twice a week and has meetings with certain business people. His mother died when he was 3 years old. And in 1917, they had, or 1918, I think it was, they had there was an epidemic of influenza, and it went all over the world. And his mother died of this influenza, and he was 3 years old. So he grew up without a mother, so maybe that explains also part of his tenacity. Here's his family before the war. This is my father. I think here he looks like he was maybe 8 years old. Most everybody were observant. That was just, they were observant Jews. That's just the life that they led. And so you can see from the beard of his father that they were observant. And so his father was left over with children. He was a widower, so then he married somebody else. My father was very unhappy. I think his father wanted him to be a rabbi. I think that's what he always told us, that his father wanted him to be a rabbi, and he didn't want to be a rabbi. But we think now that my father was dyslexic, and so he couldn't read the Hebrew. And because I've seen him now, he writes letters backwards. So his education, he only went to 3rd grade in public school in Poland, and then they had to work, and then he ran away. So he said it took him 2 weeks by wagon to get from their little town to Warsaw. There was a fellow there that knew many people from the community, and he had big 3 large delicatessen stores in Poland. You know, everyone's heard of Polish sausage and Polish bologna and so forth. And he had a factory where he made all of these products, and then he sold them. And he took my father in. He was a bachelor, and my father said he was very smart and very shrewd. And so we also think my father learned a lot of things from him, because he was his mentor. Finally, when he was conscripted in the army, he was in the cavalry. And he got to be a corporal, even though there were prejudices against the Jews. I think this was a higher rank, and he rose to the higher rank. But then when the Germans invaded Poland, he said that the cavalry was no match for all the armament of the Germans, and so they went down very quickly. So after they went down, it's some kind of mystery to us how he ended up in Auschwitz. We don't know. He never really said it to us. As I said, they never talked too much about their history. When he ended up, when he was in Poland, though, in Warsaw, before the war, there's this photo here, and this shows the family before the war. Here's my father, and he's, kind of jaunty. That's how he still is. This is his father and 3 of his sisters. And this one sister that's really laughing and smiling, she's very happy because my father found this picture and he explained it to us that in those days, if a girl wanted to get married, she had to have a dowry to pay to the family of the groom. And his father didn't have the money. They, sometimes were good, sometimes were bad, but my father always had money. And so they came to Warsaw, and my father gave the money for the dowry of his sister. So here they are walking on the streets of Warsaw, and that's why my father's very jaunty, because he could help the family and help his sister. But everybody in this picture except my father perished in the Holocaust. In this photo here, as I said, this is my father. This is his stepbrother, a son from previously. Both of them ended up in Auschwitz. This is his other brother, Moishe, and he worked in a labor camp in the 30s, which earned him transit to go to Israel. So he went to Israel much before the war. But later he did come back and help my father start his business. But everyone else perished. They all died. And my father told me that, or he told us that they died in a place called Helmno, which people from that area, the Jews from that area, were rounded up and taken to the countryside where they had to, I'm sure you've seen this, where they had to dig a pit and disrobe and go in the pit, and then they shot everybody. And I just read it there were 30,000 people that died there. And then they closed up the pit, and that's what happened to the whole town and everybody that was left there. They were massacred and buried. So this they found out afterwards. So an interesting story that my father tells is that when he was about 5 years old, he had this very strange dream in the night. And he dreamt that they were in the forest in Poland, and there was snow all the way around them. And he didn't say who was with him. He just said there were some of us, and he said there was a cabin in the forest, and there was a fireplace, and they went inside, and it was nice and warm, and there was food there. And it was, he said it was a lovely dream, but it passed. Well, at the end of the war, I should say, during the war, my father was a forced laborer and worked in the coal mines because he was very strong. And he said he came before Dr. Mengele 2 or 3 times, and I don't know if you're familiar with him. He was the person that said, you will live and you will die. And anyone that didn't look fit went one way. And that was to the gas chambers and the ultimate crematorium. And those that went there were children, of course, pregnant women, old people, anybody that looked infirm. Anyone that looked like maybe they could work went the other way. So my father said he survived because he came before Dr. Mengele those 2 times, and if Dr. Mengele said go to the right, and he didn't know what that was, he did the opposite. He went to the left. And so he survived because they had their selection process, and so then he survived. So he had been in Auschwitz working in the coal mines for 5 years. His stepbrother, he had a job in the camp. he was a barber by trade. So he was valuable to the Nazis, and he shaved them and cut their hair and so forth. So he had a relatively safe and comfortable existence. And somehow he found, however many inmates were there, they all found each other. So he found his stepbrother, and because my Uncle Abe was a barber, he got extra bread. So the officers would give him a little bit of extra bread. So he gave bread to my father, and so my father was able to survive a little bit better too. So then in 1945, when the Allies finally made the invasion, they took all the walkable inmates and they went on a march. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, they call it the Death March. And so they really had their ragtag clothes, and if some were lucky, they had wooden shoes. If others weren't lucky, they didn't have any shoes. And they had to trek in the middle of winter, and they trekked until people died and fell by the side of the road. And just trekked and trekked and trekked. Well, my father and his stepbrother, and then there was one other fellow that's not in this picture, but they were from this small town, the three of them, got to the back, and they dispersed in the forest. And the Nazis didn't either bother to get him or didn't look, or they all were just walking, so they ran away in the forest. Lo and behold, there was the house or the cabin that he dreamt of when he was 5 years old, which is kind of incredible. They came to this little cabin and they went inside, and there was food on the table, and it was nice and warm, and there was a fire in the hearth, and that's what kind of saved them. And they stayed there for a while before they moved on to their next destination. My mother was from the same town also, but she always says my father was kind of beneath her because he wasn't that handsome, and she was very pretty. So when they were younger, and they were in class together, she said she wouldn't really look at him. He wasn't her type. So when they came back, my mother had been in the Partisans, which I will get into that later. She was with two other women, and they said, you take him, and you take him, and I'll take him. And that's how they got married. So that's why they took whoever was there, and eventually they got married in Germany, when they went to Germany. My parents came to America through Ellis Island. This was from the Ellis Island Foundation. When they came to America, they were with their cousin, and the cousin told them they had to leave after a week because my mother was pregnant, and they thought it was too much responsibility. So they rented a little flat in Boyle Heights. This photo is also before the war, and here's my father. This must have been before he ran away. Perhaps he was 12 here, and this is his older brother that went to Israel, and these two sisters perished. My mother, she had another husband before the war. He was someone from their hometown, and she married him. My mother and her husband somehow ended up in the Lodz ghetto. And the ghetto was a certain area where they were rounding up the Jews and putting them in a small little area until they were deported to the concentration camps and perished. So her husband was a mechanic by trade. They all had their trades because they were not elite enough to have an education, to go to school, to have a college education, plus they didn't have money. So he was a mechanic, and all of the Germans and the Polish, everybody took all the men, so there were no mechanics left. So he was in demand, and he worked on the Nazis' cars or their motorcycles, so he had preference in the Lodz ghetto. And somehow the guard by the gate let them out, and so they ran away into the forest, and that's how they came upon to be in the Partisans or freedom fighters. Her husband looked Christian, as she said, so he would don a Nazi's uniform and nobody would really, he was able to infiltrate and do certain things. Well, he was killed, and so she was left a widow there in the partisans, so she was most probably a target, but she didn't talk about it then. When they came to Norco, because they were zoned out, we moved here on 5 acres of land on Mountain Avenue with a few hundred little baby chicks. So our business grew and grew and grew, and at one time we had 400 employees. And I think the trucks are still on the road because the business was sold about 12 years ago to a company that was related to Land O'Lakes. And so they have the company now, although they moved out of the Norco facility, and we have another facility in Fontana, and they're still running that one there and renting that one from us. So in the 80s, our whole family, they did an article on us around Easter in the LA Times, and it was called Ranchers Keeping Their Sunny Side Up, and this was our family then. You can see my mother, my parents. This was my daughter, who I said was 18 months old in the picture, and she's 32 now and has 3 kids. And there's me and my siblings and my brother, and my first husband, and the husband of my sister. And so this was in the LA Times, and it went all over. So that for once, the eggs got good public relations. But because we were Norco, you have to participate in the community, and so we always gave eggs to whoever wanted them, and that was one of my jobs. People would call me, and I'd give away so many eggs. They said, "Why are you giving so many eggs away?" Especially my father, so then I wouldn't put the order out until he left. Whoever called, generally, I gave them the eggs, and a lot of church groups also. And so we also participated in the Norco Fair, the Norco Rodeo, and so we always tried to be good neighbors and friends in the community, because we did have these issues. At the time, we did have about 800,000 chickens in Norco. We don't have them anymore, but that creates a lot of fertilizer and flies and so forth. So in the 60s, before, when we first moved here, Norco was just in the county, and our address, I recall, was Route 1, Box 98, Corona. So Norco didn't even have a post office then. So I think the county was approaching Norco to envelop it, and if the county enveloped it, then we wouldn't be able to have our chickens there. So my father funded the city's efforts to incorporate, and as a matter of fact, the first mayor of Norco worked for my father. So that's probably who approached him, and so my father gave $10,000 for Norco to incorporate, and so then that saved our business also. So that was the story most of the years, to try to save his business. That was his goal his whole life. He thinks so much about his business, and at 95 or 97, he's still streaming along, despite all of his trials and tribulations that he had in his life. He overcame his illnesses, discrimination everywhere, and he still says there's no place like America. And he said once to me, "If you think you don't get something because you're a Jew, you better forget that. That's not what happens here, and everybody's free in America, and you can realize all your dreams here." So that's the story of my parents, the immigrants to America, how they survived. My father was a survivor of Auschwitz. He was there for 5 years, and my mother was a partisan fighter in the forest. She also was there for 5 years. How they got together after they were married, and all their families were killed. My mother had 7 siblings, and nobody was left. We don't have anybody from my mother's side of the family, so we really don't have anybody. I never knew my grandparents. I didn't have any grandparents. I had only one uncle up there, and he died. He did come in the 50s to help my father. He left Israel and came to the 50s to help my father build his farm, but that's it. We don't have any relatives anywhere. So sad as it is, we, the next generation, we have to make our own lives and rebuild and try to give our children perhaps what we didn't have. At the height of our business, we were Entrepreneurs of the Year by Ernst & Young. They call it something else now, but I was involved politically, and somehow I was approached, so my parents and I were Entrepreneurs of the Year in the agribusiness community. And here's a picture of my father standing next to racks of eggs in the plant that was in this article. But the farm is not functioning anymore. All the chickens are gone. So we sold the business, but he kept all the land. So we still have the land in Norco, 110 acres there around the former Norco Ranch. And they're in the process of trying to do some development on it. And that's where we are now. And that's what my father's focus is at 95 or 97. What is he going to do with the land? And so that's definitely the American dream, that you can overcome adversity, religious prejudice, annihilation, and still be successful in America, even if you're of a different class.